So we've talked a little bit about some of the trends and how they're combining together to make this macro trend where talent is really looking at a career more like a consumer in many areas. What I want to do now is to just translate that across to succession planning and take you through a series of observations of questions, which I think that this poses for succession planning and what that might mean. So the first of these is really quite a challenge around succession planning. I see a lot of succession planning approaches which talk about success as quite long term, so 4-5 years plus. And I think if we build on some of these trends, I think a question it has to ask is what is the point of perhaps having some of those longer term succession plans? Should we actually be focusing more on perhaps shorter succession timelines, 2 years, maybe 3 max, but really focusing on creating much more robust succession within those shorter timeframes? And I think this then is a much better fit for that portfolio career mindset ultimately. But I think it's also worth saying that the world is becoming a more complex and volatile place. This VUCA environment, as it's often described, volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, is really becoming part and parcel of the organisational backdrop. And so does it even make sense to have a strategy beyond 2 to 3 years in an organisation? So I think everything is beginning to point towards perhaps shortening some of those succession time horizons and focusing much more on what we've got control of. So if it is that uncertain, let's focus on a shorter time frame and focus on driving more tangible outcomes. So I think that for me is the first of maybe 5 key questions that this raises for succession planning. I think if we were then to look at the second, this is about mobility. Now, mobility has always been a fundamental part of a succession planning and career discussion. I think it's something which in the past has not been handled very well. There's definitely a requirement in this new world that I'm describing to much more ably articulate the implications of mobility and to have a much higher quality discussion and a much more realistic discussion around mobility. What we've had in the past is a situation where mobility data cannot really be relied upon. Sometimes it's just been a manager's guess around the mobility of an individual. The individual may not even have been involved in a discussion around mobility or career aspiration. Some assumptions can be made. But I think more often what we see is a situation where there's almost career pressure on people around mobility. There's an unwritten rule that if you're not mobile, you're effectively opting out of the career structure. And this simply isn't true, and it can't be true. It can't be true in the future. It can't be true now, otherwise there'd be no real movement in our organisations. I think another risk is that we don't look at mobility as a dynamic thing. There is a tendency once someone said, well, you know what, I'm not really mobile, for that to become their brand, that to become an association with them that follows them through every discussion. And people don't go back and close the loop and say, is that still the case? The reality for most people is that there will be periods of their life where they may be more mobile than others, and certainly periods where they may not wish to consider moving geographically, for example. You might have a young family. I think it's also true to say there are times when suddenly your mobility may increase. I can remember many discussions with individuals where they've said, well, you know what, when the kids leave school or when they go to university or whatever, then actually my mobility suddenly increased, and that's the point at which I could consider some really quite brave moves to other countries, other cultures. So key to this for me is the manager, because this is where rubber hits the road. So I think we need to really make it clear that managers need to be engaging in a discussion that includes a discussion of mobility, to give them some ways of talking about mobility that perhaps demystify it a little bit for them, that give them a little bit more confidence. And at the same time, that data's got to be collected by HR processes, HR systems, and it's got to be dynamic. It's got to be reviewed. That's why when we look at, for example, some of the systems which Headlight operate, the ability for an employee to update their mobility as and when it requires updating, in a way short-circuits some of those risks, because what we're doing is really making that data dynamic. But all too often that connection isn't made. A nice way of thinking about mobility, just staying on that topic for a minute, is to look at the elephant in the room and say, well, just because you're not mobile doesn't mean you can't have a career. So I think we need to start thinking about mobility as, if you are not mobile, you can still progress, you can still develop, there'll still be opportunities. But the reality is, the more mobile that you are, the more opportunities may present themselves to you. And I think for most managers, that's a very plausible way of talking about mobility. They almost feel caught between a black and white world of, well, you're either mobile or you're not, you'll either have a career or you won't. But I think the reality is it's a sliding scale, and the more mobile you are, well, you know, there are no guarantees, but more opportunities may come your way. But let's be clear, you can still have a career and not be mobile in all the organisations that I know. So the third area for me is now about management. I mean, I've alluded to it in terms of the discussion, but I want to broaden that now to talk about good managers, average managers, and actually poor managers. Because one of the key factors I think we need to feed into succession planning, now that we look at some of these trends, and we particularly look at the value proposition of an organisation, which is essentially delivered or brokered through the manager, it means you need to have managers who know how to have these dialogues with individuals around career and who can engage an individual in the organisation. If that isn't happening, then it's far more likely now with some of these trends that you could see that individual moving on to another organisation, or moving on sooner than they'd planned to. At the same time, it could affect their performance. So for succession planning to work really well, the manager's got to be able to collate the data, and it's got to be accurate data. But I think more importantly, they've got to be able to have realistic and proactive discussions with an individual, honest discussions. The individual needs to feel that they can put things on the table in front of their manager, and the manager will broker the needs of the organisation and their own needs and come up with what's hopefully the best fit. What we find, of course, is that many times managers struggle to talk careers. And the most common reason that I hear for that is that they have a reluctance, a fear almost, of creating an expectation in the individual that perhaps can't be met. My own personal view is I think that's just a question of training and equipping them with the tools to have that discussion. It's eminently feasible to talk about career without making guarantees. But I think if we can help managers with a toolkit about how to have those discussions, equip them with the right data to have those discussions, enable them with systems, then we're moving in the right direction. I'm also a fan of a trend that I can just see emerging at the moment. At the moment it's quite small, but I think it's growing, where there are organisations getting much more hard-nosed about management capability. I think if we were all being really honest, we'd say that in the past, being bad at managing people has been a mission-critical element of a role that organisations have tolerated poor performance in. Much more so than other areas of role. If you were working in finance and you weren't very good at accounting skills, you probably wouldn't last very long. But actually all over lots of different functions, we allow bad managers to continue being bad managers in many areas, or at least average managers. Some organisations now are beginning to take a stand on this. In talent reviews, they're asking the question beyond the individual and saying, well, if the individual has something that we could do something with, and they also want to do something with it themselves, are they working with a manager that will enable that, will support that? And if the answer is no, they're unafraid to move them. This has had quite an interesting side effect, because obviously if you are one of those managers and perhaps you're not engaging with this fully, or actually you're just not very good at it, the risk is you are going to start losing talent to managers who are better at it than you. So I think there's quite a lot of incentive to get better at it. It's quite a brave move, but it's one I quite like, actually. One area which I think we can really help managers with easily is just giving them a bit of a framework, a bit of a format for having a career discussion. And there are tools and career frameworks that can help managers navigate some of the intricacies of this. So, for example, being able to talk about not detailed role profiles, but generic buckets of experience that you would need really to have under your belt to be a credible candidate for a particular role, be they people management skills, be they commercial skills, or expertise or specialism in a particular area, and the level to which you might need that, just broadly. Do you need a little bit of it, quite a lot of it, or do you really need to be a global leader in it, in the organisation? Helps people plot a career course because they can see at any point in their career what they've accrued en route, but also what types of experience remain. For example, if you've become a global expert in finance in a particular sort of niche, and you want to be a CFO, then you probably need to acquire more commercial experience and more people management experience. So let's start steering the career conversation around opportunities that might deliver some of that. And I think this is where systems can help as well. If we think about the way in which some of the headlight tools can talk about skills gaps, can talk about match between career profiles and what an individual has managed to accrue in terms of skills and experience to this stage. There are two other elements I want to talk about. The first of those is really a more philosophical point around succession planning, and that's about where do you draw the line. I'm quite bullish about this because I have this view that succession planning approaches in organisations should match the way that talent thinks about their careers. Talent thinks about its careers across organisational boundaries most often. That's very much a match with the trends that I've described and supported by a lot of the recent research. Why is it, therefore, that we tend to think about career development just within the boundaries of our own organisations when the likelihood of that being the case for any length of time is perhaps less than it has been in the past? There will always be people who want to remain in an organisation for a long time, and there will always be organisations who can offer a massive variety of experiences for people, can absorb that. But there are a lot of organisations who can offer certain things but not others. And when that kind of dries up, it's in those situations that individuals think, well, then I need to go somewhere else to get that scout badge, that new piece of experience or skill that I need to develop my own brand, to develop my future marketability. I think it would be great for organisations to, rather than fighting this, to recognise when meeting that might take them out of a core skill or a core competency where it actually might create inefficiencies in their organisation. I mean, how many international assignments are driven really by a last-minute effort to keep someone in the organisation, and actually what comes out of it is not always the positive result that we might want, but actually it could be financially difficult, or it could actually create an issue for the individual. So I'd like to see organisations really sitting down with people and looking ahead and saying, does it look like we're going to be able to stay in partnership here into the future, or does it look like one of us is running out of road? Either you're going to want something that we can't economically give you, or actually your skill set and our strategy are no longer a match. And I think it's at those junctures that we should really be looking at career planning in other organisations as well. So imagine a scenario, Ian, where I said to you, we've just spent 3 great years together. It's been really good. In about 18 months' time, we can see where the potential you've got and the opportunities we can provide in the current climate are going to be a little bit out of kilter. So why don't you think about perhaps going to company B over here learning about this skill, learning about customer-centric sales or whatever it is, and then come back into our organisation in another role and really help move us on with that experience that you've learned actually outside of our organisation. If you still think we're a good organisation to work for. So this is tremendously brave thinking in a way, because what you are relying upon is your employer brand. You're relying on actually being attractive enough to let someone go and to get them back, and keeping a communication or dialogue going with them while they're away. But this is the reality of how the talent market works. The person you're speaking to is probably thinking already that they're going to be working for a number of different organisations. They may be proactively even looking to enable one of those moves now. So I think it makes sense to at least put both those approaches on the same page. The last point I want to make really is about how we look at succession planning. I would strongly urge organisations to think about succession planning, not just as an HR process, as a business risk management process, like many other business risk management processes. The kind of risks that you're managing are decision-making risk, are in some cases confidence in the external markets, risks around that in terms of your talent pipeline, in terms of your leadership capability. But as well, you're managing business continuity risk. Succession planning is not always about the top of the organisation. Some of the critical roles are often further down the organisation. Sometimes it's not just about having the right person in the role or a high potential. Sometimes it's just about the risk is associated with having someone in the role all the time. And that's why emergency cover, for example, is something which those organisations who are really effective at succession planning make a differentiation between emergency cover and through succession. So having an understanding of critical roles and those roles which require emergency cover is really key. But the risk element really is made up of a number of components. There's an individual capability risk, there's a organisational risk, and there's a market risk. Let me expand upon it more. When you look at the requirements of any particular role, and then you look at the capabilities of any individual, what we're really talking about is a degree of overlap between the two. But actually, depending upon whether you're the individual or the corporation, you look at it in a different way. So if I'm the individual, actually I'm looking to progress my career, I'm looking to move up the ladder, I'm keen to be better remunerated, I'm keen to have development stretch. And so in a way, I'm looking at the largest underlap that I can cope with in many ways. So there could be quite a low overlap between my capabilities and the requirements of the role. I want to grow into the role. I want to be engaged by the role. I want it to interest me for a period of time. But in many ways, that's the opposite of what the organisation would like. The organisation would like to manage its risk. The organisation would like me to move into that role and be able to do it with my eyes closed. But actually, that's not going to yield much engagement for me. I'm probably going to get bored in the role. I'm probably going to leave. And so you have these two competing factors, this dilemma that needs to be reconciled through succession planning. And the third one, the market factor, is just really then looking at the degree to which, if there is a gap between those two, it can't be filled inside. It maybe needs to be filled from the market. And so you get that dialogue between internal and external fulfillment of that role. And this is why succession planning itself is a business conversation around risk, supported by systems that come from conversations between managers and employees. So all the elements come together. So you end up with these three circles, as I often describe it, where you'll talk about what the organisation needs, which is often created by strategic workforce planning work or by logical deduction from the strategy and objectives. You're looking at what the employee has in terms of their skill set, their performance, their potential, if you like, depending on how you measure it. And then the third very important area of what the individual wants, their aspirations, their motivators, their mobility, a number of these factors. And really the job of the manager is to broker that to the best outcome, to try and balance those sometimes competing needs and to solve it for the good of the business and the good of the individual. Now, to do that, they need data to be available to fuel that discussion. It's also critical that the processes that surround that enable that data to be used properly. So, for example, making sure that succession planning or talent reviews make due consideration of updated employee mobility data, for example. And then I think lastly, it's just re-emphasizing this whole piece about needing to focus on the line manager capability, and investing in line manager upskilling. Because if there's one thing which sits at the center of all of these trends, it's that they all push line management to the forefront. We can no longer rely purely upon processes. We can no longer rely on an employee feeling that they're going to build a career in one company. It comes down to that delivery of the brand and the experience of an organization between a manager and the individual employee. So I think that's a critical element. So that to me are the sort of 5 or 6 key questions, issues, problems that I think come out of this analysis of the market trends at the moment in the way that it pertains to succession planning.